Andrew Tate, Sneako, Fresh and Fit, and other alpha male channels on YouTube all have one thing in common. They are all cowards. And let me explain why. The problem with a lot of these channels is that they tend to view vulnerability or showing weakness as something that's really bad and horrible. And they pride themselves on being tough and never faltering. On the surface, we think that this is really strong character, but in reality, this is something that shows a huge amount of insecurity and a lack of courage. Courage can be thought of as the opposite of cowardice. And courage is typically defined as when we're afraid to do something, but we do it anyway. What about telling everyone about your greatest accomplishments or bragging about how many Bugattis you have or how successful you are is scary? What is courageous about never crying in front of people? By definition, none of these men ever meet the criteria for being courageous. They rarely do things that are scary and then do them anyway. The reason that they can never do anything courageous is because they lack the simple ability to do one thing that any courageous act requires: being vulnerable. Unfortunately, for a lot of men, vulnerability is seen as something that you should never do. Don't be a crybaby. Man up. Don't be a toughen up. So many men will completely bottle up all of their emotions, never expressing how they feel to anyone in their lives. And then they wonder why they struggle to date or struggle to find friends and why they can't make any meaningful connections. The statistics around male loneliness and male mental health are incredibly concerning. The rate of men who want to unalive themselves is significantly higher than the rate for women. And a lot of this can be attributed to the fact that men are incredibly lonely. Nearly 2/3 of men aged 18 to 23 said that they felt that no one really knows them. And nearly 15% of men say that they have no close friendships, which is a 5-fold increase from 1990. It makes sense that a whopping 44% of men had some kind of thoughts of no longer being alive within the past 2 weeks. The inability of men to open up and talk about things that they're going through is incredibly alarming and is incredibly painful to see. In my own personal life, I've had so many guys talk to me about something really difficult and traumatic that they went through, only to have them tell me that I'm the only person that they've ever told that thing to, because I'm usually one of the only male friends that they have that is open and talks about my emotions. Many of my friends who are girls will say similar things about guys they go on dates with or about their boyfriends, where they'll talk about being their boyfriend or date's therapist and how this is incredibly frustrating, since many men have no other male friends to turn to or women friends to turn to whom with they can be very vulnerable. Oftentimes their girlfriend or someone that they're dating will become their therapist, and this can be extremely emotionally taxing for the girl that's involved, because no one should have to be the sole emotional support for another human being. That's incredibly draining and a lot to ask of anyone. So what can men do about this? How can they kind of break out of this cycle of bottling all their emotions up, having no one to talk to, and then unloading it all onto one person, pushing them away, and then feeling lonely again and dealing with worsening mental health symptoms throughout their life? The first step is to properly understand what is vulnerability and how can we use it in order to improve our lives and mental health. If you want a really in-depth understanding on what is vulnerability, I recommend checking out Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly. She dives deeply into vulnerability, courage, and shame in this book, but in this video, we're not going to go as deep as a whole book's worth, but we will give a basic definition that can help us establish some groundwork. The definition I have for vulnerability is as follows. Vulnerability is showing the parts of ourselves that we are most afraid to show others willingly, and opening ourselves up for the pain that may come from doing so. Some examples of vulnerability is like telling a girl that you have feelings for her knowing that she might not reciprocate. This is when we tell our friends that when they make jokes about certain things, it hurts our feelings and we'd prefer it if they stop making those jokes. This is when we admit that we're wrong during an argument and we express a sincere apology and ask what we can do in order to be better in the future. This looks like a time when one of my friends told me about how he was cheated on and how it deeply affected him emotionally, and he didn't know who he was as a man anymore. In each of these scenarios, we're expressing something that leaves us open to being ridiculed, to being criticized, to having other people look at us differently. It causes an anxious feeling in our chest. It feels like it's hard to breathe, and we feel really scared about what we're gonna say. But the fact that it's so terrifying and the fact that it's so difficult for so many men to do is what shows us that it requires immense courage. And it's the reason why a lot of these alpha male YouTubers are never vulnerable. They never talk about their deepest, darkest, or most difficult moments, their mental health struggles, how they feel when their family has ostracized them as Sneako's has, how they felt when they went to jail and had their entire careers ruined because of a horrible decision that they made. We can't see them taking accountability and talking about what their dating life is really like and why they struggle to find marriage in the case of Fresh and Fit. The reason they can't do these things is again because of deep insecurity. The more that we can recognize the things that these alpha male figures do as being insecure and toxic and being completely filled with cowardice, the better that men's mental health will get. Once we start becoming vulnerable, we experience expose ourselves to another person. We let down our walls and our barriers, and we become truly who we are. And when we open ourselves up like that, it oftentimes gives other people the permission to open up too. And this gives us true, meaningful connection. And this not only solves loneliness, but makes it way easier to go through the trials and tribulations of mental illness, because we have someone else there who's on our side, who's walking through the fire with us. In my opinion, there's absolutely nothing weak about that. Crying in front of somebody else and telling them how you really feel is one of the most difficult things to do. And I guarantee any of these alpha male YouTubers have never been able to do such a thing because of the immense amount of courage it requires. So how do we be vulnerable? There are some simple things to keep in mind. One of the biggest things that I see people fall into as a trap is they'll start being vulnerable with everybody. And the thing is, we shouldn't be vulnerable with anybody, because being vulnerable is something special. We should only be vulnerable with those who we really trust and who really understand us and who know us well. The way we can figure out who is a safe person to be vulnerable around is kind of by being more vulnerable slowly over time. We might start by talking about things that are easy for us to discuss, but we wouldn't just tell anyone. For example, for me, I know I don't have the greatest fashion sense, so if I kind of talk about that, that's a bit of an insecurity of mine, but it's not something that really keeps me up at night. When we talk about these things that we're kind of insecure about, and we show a little bit of vulnerability, we can gauge other people's reactions to see if they're helpful, to see if they're kind, and to see if they'll encourage us to be more vulnerable and help us feel better and more connected with them. And once we kind of test the waters by being a little bit vulnerable, understand who is a supportive, kind person in our life, we can start to slowly over time become more and more vulnerable with the correct people. If you're vulnerable with everyone, that's an incorrect way to do it, because vulnerability is something special. It's something that people should earn the privilege to be able to see from you. We need to hold vulnerability sacred, but we also must not see it as a bad thing to do. The second big thing you have to do as well is allow other people to be vulnerable with you. One of the biggest reasons that men struggle with being vulnerable with other men is because other men are really bad at allowing people to be vulnerable around them. So how do we allow other people to be vulnerable? Oftentimes men will kind of try to solve the issue that the other person is talking about. So they might be opening up about something really difficult or deep, and they'll either dismiss it, say it's not that big of a deal, it's not that difficult of a problem, or they'll point out really obvious solutions to the problem that the person is facing. The thing is, when someone's trying to be vulnerable, they're not there for solutions. They're trying to find someone else to relate to them and to help them feel less alone as they walk through a difficult period in their life. To do exactly that, don't offer up solutions unless you're explicitly asked for them. Try and just deeply, fully understand what they're going through. Open your heart up to them. Think about times when you've been through something similar and share those things with them as well. You want to try as hard as you can to feel what they are feeling and ask them questions to try and understand what it is about the thing they're going through that is giving them so much pain and difficulty, and relate to them where you can. If someone says something to you while they're being vulnerable that you have felt in your life as well, be sure to share it if it's someone you feel safe and comfortable doing so with. One of the other biggest things is, how do you find other people to be vulnerable with? This is extremely hard for a lot of men, but luckily there's lots of great support groups and stuff like that all over the nation. One of my favorites to go to that I personally love is Emotions Anonymous. I highly recommend you check out if there's a local chapter in your area. These support groups have absolutely changed my life. It's a great place for you to just express yourself in a really safe, comfortable way, and it can be kind of a stepping stone to being vulnerable with people in your life. When you kind of go and see strangers who don't really have an impact on your day-to-day life, it can be a lot easier to be vulnerable in a specific situation where it's designed for people to be vulnerable in. Once you get comfortable being vulnerable there, it can be a little bit easier being vulnerable out in the real world. Now, to end this video, I want to lead by example. I wouldn't just tell you to be vulnerable without being vulnerable myself, as I know how difficult it can be. So to end this video, I wanted to talk about some of the most difficult things that I have went through and share my experiences so that you can possibly feel a little bit better as well. One of the most difficult things that I've actually dealt with throughout my life is dealing with borderline personality disorder. I've made lots of videos on it, and I've kind of talked about tips and strategies, but there aren't many videos where I've really dived deep into what some of the biggest struggles that I had were. One of the biggest things that I struggled with, that I still struggle with to this day, that causes me a lot of shame and embarrassment, is the fact that I have an extremely high fear of abandonment. If I like someone and I'm romantically interested in them, or even if I just have, a friend that I really like, if they don't text me back within like an hour, within 10 minutes sometimes, immediately sometimes, I'll start to completely overthink and kind of freak out. There have been many times where I've texted people, 10 or 20 times in a row. I've called them, tried to figure out like why they won't respond, so on and so forth. I've made a fool of myself many times by doing this, and I pushed a lot of people away because of how clingy and obsessive I can be sometimes. And this is something that's really difficult for me to talk about because it's something that's very embarrassing. But the thing is, that is being vulnerable. It's about sharing things that are embarrassing to you, that are difficult to you, and putting them out there, even though you might get judged or ridiculed for them. Of course, I've worked on this issue quite a bit, and I've tried really hard to get over it, but I'll be honest, even even after nearly half a decade of working on this issue, I still really struggle with it from time to time. I can tell that this is something that I am being currently vulnerable about because I can feel those feelings of fear in my chest. I feel uncomfortable saying these things and knowing that other people might watch them and then cast their judgments upon me, whatever they may be. But the thing is, I did it anyway. And now that you've seen someone else be vulnerable, I'm hoping that you can as well. Down in the comments below, I challenge you to be vulnerable. Talk about a difficult experience you've had lately. Talk about something that's been weighing on your mind, and talk about something that maybe you're ashamed of that you don't want other people to know. I challenge you to be vulnerable in the comment section below and start reversing the trend of toxic masculinity where we view vulnerability as weakness, when in fact, vulnerability is the farthest thing from weakness. It is one of the greatest acts of courage that we can possibly do. Thank you for watching, and take care.